Have you ever wondered how, in just a few minutes, an ordinary day could turn into an absolute nightmare? Imagine this. You're on a tropical island, lush with greenery, where the sun gently warms your skin and the sound of the ocean promises peace. But what if, behind every tranquil corner, there's a shadow waiting for just the right moment to make itself known? On April 7th, 2019, Miriam Bild, a young tourist from Germany, set out for a walk to a temple on Koh Chang Island. It was supposed to be just another peaceful day of her vacation. But by evening, she hadn't returned. Security cameras captured her smiling and carefree as she headed up the trail. But little did anyone know that in just a few hours, that smile would disappear forever. Koh Chang, known for its soothing, laid-back atmosphere, rarely experiences disturbances. This island breathes with slow-paced natural beauty, turquoise waters, white sand beaches, and deep green jungles that keep secrets centuries old. Into this secluded paradise in spring 2019 came Miriam Bild, a young woman from Germany who decided to combine a business trip with a long-awaited vacation. However, her journey would soon unravel into a disturbing and tangled mystery that still leaves many questions unanswered. At first, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. Miriam was driven and successful. In fact, after graduating from the University of Hanover, her career as a design engineer with a large company had been progressing rapidly. She was used to long hours and frequent work trips, but this one felt different. After wrapping up her business obligations, Miriam decided to spend a few days on the isolated island of Koh Chang, finally fulfilling her dream of seeing the white sands and crystal-clear waters she'd heard so much about. But everything changed when Miriam didn't show up for breakfast on the morning she was supposed to leave. Concerned, hotel staff tried to contact her, but her phone was unreachable. Hours passed before her disappearance was reported to local authorities, but no one yet realized the gravity of the situation. According to official records, Miriam had come to Thailand on business, and her meeting with suppliers had gone smoothly. Her colleagues mentioned that she often liked to pair work trips with a bit of personal relaxation, even if that meant staying alone in a foreign country. It may have been this curiosity that prompted her to linger on the island as the rest of her team returned home. Miriam loved exploring the places she visited, yet according to her friends, spontaneous connections or risky adventures had never been part of her plans. Despite this, some locals remembered that Miriam had shown a keen interest in the less-traveled corners of the island. Tour guides mentioned that she asked about hidden beaches and quiet coves, places where one could feel truly isolated from the world. This curiosity seemed a little unusual to those who knew her. She typically preferred to follow a clear plan, making sure every detail was carefully thought out. Miriam wasn't new to travel, and her itinerary had been meticulously arranged. After wrapping up business in Bangkok, she planned a day trip to Pattaya before heading over to Koh Chang. Many tourists make similar short excursions to enjoy the beaches and sights, but for Miriam, it was something different. She sought places that didn't feature in the usual tourist guides, places where she could be alone with nature and her thoughts. Her journey began with a morning ferry ride that brought her to the island. True to her organized nature, Miriam rented a motorbike right away and set off along a pre-planned route. One of her intended stops was an ancient stone temple perched on a hill, reachable only by the most determined and resilient visitors. This temple was known among locals as a secluded place of reflection, hidden away behind dense foliage. The day started quietly. As she approached the temple, she was greeted by the familiar signs of a tranquil island morning. Her rented motorbike left parked at the base of the hill, and a small flower stall nearby with a vendor arranging fresh jasmine and calendula bouquets. Miriam greeted him, bought a couple of flowers, and then made her way up the stone staircase. Surveillance cameras captured her climbing the steps confidently, with a bottle of water and a small backpack. There was a light smile on her face, as if she was eagerly anticipating something meaningful and beautiful. But time passed, and she didn't return. By evening, her motorbike still stood parked beside the now closed flower stall, a silent witness to her absence. No one had seen her come back down the steps, and this quickly raised concern among the locals. The flower vendor was the first to notice that something was amiss. Miriam's motorbike was still there, untouched, and she hadn't been seen all day. The next day, he reported it to the authorities, and what started as a simple missing person case soon evolved into something far more unsettling. When investigators began tracing her route, they quickly realized that Miriam would never have stayed on the island for long. She had only planned a single day there, a short excursion, a few photos, lunch, and then a return to the mainland. Organized and cautious, Miriam always followed her own rules. She avoided strangers, kept her valuables close, and regularly checked in with family. So when the messages from her stopped, it was the first red flag for her loved ones. By noon on April 7th, she was no longer responding, and by evening it seemed as though she had simply vanished. The temple on the hilltop, where Miriam was headed, isn't a typical tourist destination. No formal tours go there, and even locals rarely visit. It's surrounded by thick jungle, and the path is long and difficult. The stone steps, damp and covered in moss, make the climb even harder. She was hiking alone, and according to security footage, no one else was nearby at the time. The police reviewed the video recordings multiple times, hoping for any clue, but all they could see was Miriam's ascent toward the temple, her stride steady, her expression calm, with a light smile on her face. Time seemed frozen in this brief clip, the last known record of her presence on the island. As police began interviewing locals, they uncovered a new lead. A couple of days prior, she had been seen at a cafe near the pier with an unfamiliar man. His identity couldn't be confirmed, but he seemed to know her well enough to sit and chat over coffee. Perhaps they had met on the ferry or at her hotel, but no one else reported seeing them together after that encounter. Miriam's disappearance stirred up a series of haunting questions. What happened on her path to the temple? Why did she never come back down? And who was the stranger she was seen talking to? On the morning of April 8, 2019, Ko Chang Island awoke to a chilling discovery. A Thai tourist out for an early morning hike to the temple, hoping to enjoy the cool air and morning calm, was about to stumble into a nightmare. As he made his way up the steep, stone-covered trail, soaking in the quiet of the jungle, he noticed something unusual near the edge of a small ravine, just off the path. Through the thick foliage, a pale shape caught his eye, a sight strikingly out of place amid the dense green. As he moved closer, it became clear. He had found the body of a young woman. She lay wedged between two large rocks, covered by branches and leaves, as if someone had tried to conceal her. The woman's body bore signs of physical trauma, and bloodstains were visible nearby. Shaken by what he'd found, the tourist immediately called the local emergency services. Within an hour, officers were making their way up the winding path to the scene, and concern quickly spread across the island like wildfire. While police on Ko Chang were trying to understand what they were facing, panic was escalating back in Germany among Miriam Bild's loved ones. She had stopped responding the evening of April 7th, which was highly unusual for her. Known for being responsible and cautious, Miriam always kept in touch, especially when traveling alone in a foreign country. Her parents, used to her regular messages and calls, became increasingly anxious, and by the next morning, after realizing they had heard nothing from her, they filed a missing person report with local authorities. Meanwhile, investigators on the island were starting to piece together the details of this troubling case. The body found in the ravine was identified as Miriam Bild, a 20-year-old tourist from Germany who, according to hotel staff, was supposed to have returned from the island on the evening of April 7th. However, her rented motorbike remained parked at the base of the hill, where she'd left it before setting out for the temple. Initially, authorities considered the possibility that Miriam had suffered a tragic accident, a slip or a loss of balance on the slick trail. But that theory was quickly dismissed. Her injuries were too severe and numerous to be explained by a simple fall. Her face and head bore clear bruises and cuts, and signs of aggression suggested that her death had been both intentional and violent. Additionally, evidence indicated that she had been assaulted before her passing, casting an even darker shadow over the case. The investigation began with a review of surveillance footage from cameras positioned along the trail and the parking area at the hill's base. The footage captured Miriam climbing the steps, holding a bottle of water and carrying a small backpack. She walked with purpose and appeared calm, but one key detail continued to disturb investigators. Just minutes after she disappeared around a bend, another individual appeared on camera. A man dressed in dark clothing was following her at a distance. When he eventually returned, his clothes appeared dirty and damp, with noticeable light-colored stains. Further investigations began to unravel the events of that day. The flower stall vendor, located at the base of the trail, remembered seeing this man. He had noticed him arrive on a motorbike, purchase a bouquet of marigolds, and then head up the trail after Miriam. It seemed innocent enough, except for the man's odd behavior on his return trip. The vendor recalled that he looked nervous, glancing around repeatedly, and when asked if everything was okay, he brushed it off, claiming he had just slipped. The vendor found his demeanor strange and decided to jot down the motorbike's license plate just in case. Once the police discovered Miriam's body and initial clues began to surface, this mysterious man quickly became the prime suspect. Surveillance footage, the vendor's description, and the recorded license plate led the authorities to identify the bike. It was registered to Ranakorn Ramruin, a 24-year-old local resident. Ranakorn worked as a beach cleaner, maintaining the coastal waters, and lived alone in an old house on the outskirts of the island. Officers immediately headed to his home, but he was nowhere to be found. They began a search, hoping to find something that might shed light on his potential connection to Miriam. At that point, underlying conflicts, previously unnoticed, began to emerge. Ranakorn was known among locals as a reclusive, somewhat eccentric figure, but few were aware of his darker tendencies. Neighbors described him as quiet, yet unwelcoming. He kept to himself and rarely confided in anyone. But those who knew him more closely had seen glimpses of erratic aggression and strange, anxious behavior. Some even claimed they'd spotted him wandering around the island as though searching for something or waiting for someone. So who was this man who seemed to have appeared out of nowhere to disrupt a young tourist's dream of a tropical paradise and turn it into a tragedy? And what drove him to follow Miriam on that day? In the early morning hours of April 7th, 2019, Ko Chang was still cloaked in silence when Ranakorn Ramruin awoke in his small home on the island's edge. The night had provided little relief. His mind was still reeling from lingering thoughts and visions, fueled by a haze of prohibited substances. His house was thick with the scent of cheap alcohol, empty bottles scattered across the table. Ranakorn knew he needed an escape from this state, something to distract him, even for a moment, so he wouldn't spiral further. A few beers and some shots of stronger alcohol became his usual ritual, a temporary escape that helped him numb his thoughts, even if just for a few hours. But on that day, his usual routine wasn't enough. After the effects of the controlled substances kicked in, he found himself craving something more, and he took an additional dose of a different substance, which quickly pushed him into an altered state. His thoughts began to pulse erratically, lacking any coherence, while a sense of agitation and excitement roiled within him. Needing an outlet, he decided to ride his motorbike somewhere, anywhere, to escape his inner chaos. Riding along the road, he eventually found himself at the base of the hill where a trail led up to one of the island's temples. It was there that he first spotted her. A young European tourist, neatly dressed, with a light, carefree stride and a relaxed expression, was making her way up the stone steps, completely unaware of the eyes watching her. The sight of this graceful, carefree young woman pulled Ranakorn out of his fogged state. He couldn't look away, and giving in to his clouded impulses, he decided to follow her. At that moment, Ranakorn stepped into a nearby stall and purchased a bouquet of marigolds, hoping this gesture would give him a friendly appearance and allow him to approach the young woman. The vendor noticed him and was struck by the man's unusual behavior. His eyes appeared empty, yet somehow filled with a strange intensity. This made the vendor uneasy, but Ranakorn didn't linger long. He soon set off up the trail after Miriam, disappearing around the bend. Meanwhile, Miriam, unaware of the shadow following her, continued her climb to the temple at a leisurely pace. She was enjoying the cool morning air and the view from the trail. For her, it was just another day in a long-awaited vacation, a brief escape after countless days of hard work. She was a seasoned traveler and knew how to keep herself safe, but even her caution couldn't have anticipated what would happen next. Surveillance footage captured Ranikorn catching up to her, holding the bouquet. At first, he tried to engage her in conversation, feigning friendliness. Miriam was polite but cautious. The gesture of offering flowers seemed more confusing than welcoming to her. She thanked him and continued on her way, but he didn't stop following her. What happened next didn't appear on the camera footage, but later became clear through witness statements and Ranikorn's own confession. Under the influence of alcohol and controlled substances, he was unable to restrain his impulses. He bluntly suggested that Miriam accompany him to a secluded spot nearby, but her response was immediate. She refused, with a tone of fear creeping into her voice. She attempted to leave, quickening her pace, but Ranikorn persistently followed, her brisk steps eventually breaking into a run. At that moment, a surge of anger ignited within him, a fury directed not only at her, but also at himself and a life that, in his mind, had long since lost its meaning. In this altered state, he was beyond reason. He caught up to her, grabbed her arm, and pulled her toward him roughly. Miriam screamed and tried to break free, but the area they were in was isolated, with no one around to hear her. He dragged her into the thick vegetation off the trail. Her struggle was intense, but in the end, she was overpowered. What began as a confrontation on the path ended in the shadows of the trees, where her cries faded into silence. When the police arrived at the scene several hours after her body was discovered, they immediately recognized that this was no random assault. The marks on Miriam's body showed signs of aggression, and the disturbed earth suggested a struggle. From the beginning, one thing was clear. After the incident, Ranikorn had likely retraced his steps down the same path, alone. The flower stall vendor had seen him as he passed by again. His clothes were stained and looked damp, and when asked if everything was okay, Ranikorn nervously replied that he had simply slipped. This strange response only heightened the vendor's suspicions, and the motorbike license plate he had noted became the key to solving the case. That evening, Ranikorn returned home. He quickly washed his clothes, but the stains didn't come out completely. He lay on his couch and turned on the TV, as if nothing had happened. Perhaps he thought that by acting normally, he could put it all behind him. But that wasn't the case. When the police came to his door, he didn't attempt to hide. It was as if he understood that this was the end and was merely waiting to be found. Though he tried to maintain composure at the time of his arrest, it soon became clear that this calm was merely a mask, concealing confusion and fear. His eventual confession during questioning didn't surprise the officers, but it revealed a level of shocking cruelty that no one expected to uncover on this peaceful island. During the interrogation, Ranikorn broke down. At first, he attempted to mislead investigators, but his story fell apart, and eventually, he started recounting what had happened in full detail. His confession stunned even the most seasoned detectives. The description of events unfolded like a nightmare set against a backdrop of tropical paradise. But the case didn't end with a simple confession. Authorities needed every detail of what had transpired. They decided to conduct a reenactment to understand exactly how the events unfolded. Ranikorn was brought back to the scene, his head covered with a bag to avoid public attention. Step by step, he demonstrated his actions, retracing his steps and showing each move. The officers observed his every gesture closely, searching for any details he might have omitted from his confession. The reenactment became a grim scene, as Ranikorn effectively replayed his disturbing role. When it was over, investigators had a complete picture of the events that had taken place on that ill-fated day. As the trial of Ranikorn Ramruin began, it was viewed as a test for the entire Thai justice system. The crime against young tourist Miriam Bild had shocked not only the local community, but also people abroad. Questions about safety for foreign visitors on islands like Koh Chang became more pressing, and authorities needed to demonstrate that justice would prevail. The court proceedings drew attention from both local and international media, with journalists capturing every detail while the public watched each day of the trial closely. Surveillance footage, the flower vendor's testimony, and Ranikorn's confession became undeniable evidence of his guilt. These pieces painted a clear picture of what had happened, how he tracked Miriam, attempted to engage her in conversation, and then followed her along the trail, leading her to a secluded area where he committed a terrible crime. Ranicorn's confession seemed like it should have answered every question, yet the atmosphere in the courtroom remained tense. The circumstances of the crime, the brutality and coldness with which he acted, left even the most seasoned court reporters visibly disturbed. However, the real drama wasn't confined to the courtroom. The only person who tried to explain, or at least understand, Ranicorn's actions was his mother. Her appearance in court took everyone by surprise, and her emotional speech left mixed reactions among those present. She didn't defend her son, but instead tried to make sense of how something like this could happen, apologizing to Miriam's family and the community. She shared that she and her son had been estranged for years, unaware of his struggles with controlled substances. Her words felt like a search for some explanation of his actions, but were by no means an excuse. In the end, she pleaded with the court to punish him to the full extent of the law, acknowledging that her son had lost control of his life and posed a danger not only to himself, but to others. Ranicorn's confession came with no remorse. He did not apologize to the victim's family, nor did he attempt to explain what drove him to act. He simply recounted the events with a detached coldness, as if recounting someone else's story. Authorities moved swiftly to avoid prolonging the trial, and just 3 months after the tragedy, a verdict was delivered. Ranicorn Ramruin was sentenced to capital punishment. Efforts by his attorneys to seek leniency proved fruitless. The severity of the crime, the harrowing details, and the public outcry left no room for mercy. One of the most emotionally charged moments of the trial was his mother's statement. Her tears, despair, and realization that she had lost her son not only physically, but morally left a powerful impression on everyone present. She admitted her fear that if he were ever released, he could repeat such a terrible act. Her final goodbye, watching her son as he was led into custody, was perhaps the most heartbreaking scene of the entire trial. She understood that he had forever lost his humanity, and this realization was the heaviest blow of all. After the verdict, the island of Ko Chang struggled to recover from the shock. Once known for its peace, tranquility, and natural beauty, it was now drawn into a horrific story that rattled the entire country. The locals, proud of their culture and hospitality, felt this tragedy deeply. To them, it was a blow to the reputation of the entire island, and they hoped this would remain an isolated incident, not a shadow cast over their beloved home. The community came together to show support for the family of the victim. People visited the spot where Miriam had been found, leaving flowers and candles as they bowed their heads in silent respect and mourning. This gesture symbolized not only their condolences, but also their desire to reject cruelty and ensure that such horrors would never happen again. But the tragedy exposed deeper issues. This story brought to light problems many preferred not to discuss: tourist safety, the darker side of life on the islands, where easy access to controlled substances and a sense of impunity could lead to such outcomes. Authorities, recognizing this, moved quickly to bring closure to the case and assured tourists and residents that the islands remained safe. Yet, not everyone was convinced. Following the trial, police made a statement affirming that incidents like this would not happen again, and that Ko Chang remained a welcoming and secure destination. But could people truly forget that something so terrible had once taken place here? The story of Miriam Bild will remain one of the heaviest and most unforgettable incidents to have occurred on this island. In her memory, Hanover University established a scholarship for young engineers, ensuring that her name and passion for learning would continue despite the tragedy. But the pain of her loss stays with her loved ones, and those who knew and cared for Miriam will never be able to forget her. So here's something to consider. Who or what can guarantee that such a tragedy won't happen again? How can we be certain that our next journey won't turn into a nightmare when even a paradise can hide its dark side? Think about this next time you plan a trip to distant places, for sometimes, behind the veil of beauty, there are things best left unknown.